Khorloogiin Choibalsan, the Stalin of the Steppe. Part 1. Origins in the Dust of the Steppe, 1895-1914. Khorloogiin Choibalsan, one of the most consequential and controversial leaders in Mongolian history, was born on 8th February 1895 in a remote and impoverished area near present-day Choibalsan in Dornat Province, then part of the Qing Empire. His birthplace, Achitbasin, was a humble location. Vast plains and sparse settlements that reflected the hardscrabble existence of Mongolia's nomadic herders. He was the youngest of 4 children born to Khorloo, a destitute, unmarried woman whose life epitomized the harsh realities of Mongolian peasantry at the twilight of Qing domination. His matronymic surname, Khorloogiin, derives from his mother's name, a practice not uncommon in a society where paternal acknowledgement was uncertain or absent. Choibalsan's father was widely believed to be a Barga tribesman named Jamsu, a Dor Mongol originating from Inner Mongolia. However, the identity of his father remained shrouded in ambiguity, and Choibalsan himself later professed ignorance regarding his paternity. This uncertainty, combined with his impoverished childhood, would shape the young boy's deep insecurities and influence his lifelong desire for power, recognition, and national renewal. He was given the birth name Dugar, a common name among Mongols of the era, yet one that would fade into obscurity as he forged a new identity. At the age of 13, the boy entered a local Buddhist monastery, Sanbasin Kuri, taking the religious name Choibalsan in line with Lamés traditions. At the time, Buddhism was deeply intertwined with Mongolian social life, education, and authority. Monasteries acted not only as spiritual centers, but also as educational and social institutions for boys from poor backgrounds. The monastery offered Dugar, now Choibalsan, a rare chance at literacy and formal instruction. Like many Mongolian boys of humble birth, entering the monastery was often the only path to upward mobility, albeit within a tightly prescribed spiritual framework. In the monastery, Choibalsan studied Buddhist scriptures, rituals, and classical Mongolian texts, training to become a lama. However, he proved to be restless, inquisitive, and defiant of monastic routine. After 5 years of monastic life, he made the bold decision to flee. Alongside another novice, he escaped to Kuri, also known by its Russian name, Urga, then the capital and spiritual heart of Mongolia. Their flight was not only a physical departure, but a symbolic break from the old order, from religion toward revolution, from submission to self-determination. In Kure, Choibalsan lived on the margins of society. With no family or fortune, he scraped together a meager existence through odd jobs. His fortune changed when he encountered a Buryat teacher named Nikolai Danchinov. A Russian-educated intellectual and sympathizer of young Mongolian reformers, Danchinov saw potential in the disheveled runaway and took him under his wing. To shield the young man from forced return to the monastery, Danchinov secured Choibalsan's enrollment in the Russian-Mongolian translator school at the Russian consulate. This was a transformative step. The Russian school introduced Choibalsan to Western languages, secular thought, and revolutionary ideologies, all of which would play crucial roles in his later political development. It was at the translator school that Choibalsan first encountered Russian literature, Marxist thought, and nationalist aspirations. He began to see Mongolia not as an isolated feudal land of monasteries and tribal chiefs, but as a nation in need of radical change. He learned to interpret Russian texts, not only linguistically but politically. The flames of revolution were beginning to kindle. After a year of study, Choibalsan was selected to continue his education in Russia. In 1914, just as Europe was descending into the chaos of World War I, he journeyed to Irkutsk to attend a gymnasium, a secondary school that offered a rigorous curriculum in language, history, philosophy, and science. This period in Russia was marked by intense intellectual ferment and rising revolutionary sentiments. Irkutsk itself had a reputation for radicalism, home to Russian exiles, dissidents, and Bolshevik sympathizers. For Choibalsan, the city became a crucible where his political consciousness deepened and his understanding of Marxist ideology matured. Living among Russian students and emigre intellectuals, the young Mongolian absorbed the rhetoric of class struggle, proletarian revolution, and anti-imperialism. He also forged connections with other young Mongolian students studying in Russia, many of whom would later become his comrades in revolution. By 1917, when the Russian Empire collapsed in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution, Choibalsan was a committed revolutionary in thought, if not yet in deed. His time in Irkutsk planted in him the seeds of a new Mongolia, liberated from Chinese domination, free from aristocratic oppression, and guided by socialist ideals. Thus, from the windswept steppes of Ashit-Basin to the revolutionary salons of Irkutsk, the early life of Khorloogiin Choibalsan was one of transformation, defiance, and growing conviction. Born a herder's illegitimate son and trained as a monk, he emerged as a passionate student of revolution, already envisioning a future in which he would play a decisive role in reshaping Mongolia's destiny. Part 2, Flames of Revolution. Choibalsan and the 1921 Mongolian Revolution. By the close of the 1910s, the world was being reshaped by revolution and empire. The October Revolution of 1917 had toppled the Russian monarchy and introduced Bolshevik rule, while the Qing dynasty's collapse in 1911 had thrown Mongolia into political confusion and vulnerability. The subsequent Chinese occupation of Outer Mongolia in 1919 deepened national unrest and created a new sense of urgency among Mongolian patriots seeking independence. Against this backdrop, Khorloogiin Choibalsan returned from his studies in Russia to a homeland that teetered on the edge of transformation and violence. In 1919, shortly after the Chinese occupation intensified, the Bogd Khan, the theocratic monarch of Mongolia, called back young Mongolian students who had been studying in Russia. Many of these students had been exposed to radical ideologies and viewed the traditional Mongolian social structure as corrupt, backward, and unsustainable. Among them was Choibalsan, now in his mid-20s, emboldened by revolutionary teachings and resolved to act. In Kuri, modern-day Ulaanbaatar, Choibalsan joined a clandestine cell of revolutionaries known as the Konsulin Denj, or Consular Hill Group. This circle was composed of politically awakened Mongolian youth who had studied in Russia and sympathized with Bolshevism. Their aim was clear: to resist Chinese domination and build a new political order inspired by Marxist-Leninist principles. Key members of the group included Dambin Chagdarjov, Derizavin Losol, and Dogsomin Bodu, a former teacher and early mentor to Choibalsan during his time at the translator's school. Because of his fluency in Russian, Choibalsan served a vital role within the group, acting as their translator and intermediary with the Russian consulate. These diplomatic ties would later prove instrumental in connecting the Mongolian revolutionaries with Soviet support. In 1920, the Consular Hill Group merged with another secretive revolutionary faction known as the Zun Kuri, East Kure Group, which included such notable figures as Solin Danzan, Dansrabaligin Dogsum, and Damdin Sukbatar. On 25 June 1920, this merged revolutionary body was formally established as the Mongolian People's Party, MPP, the first modern political party in the country's history. This marked the birth of organized revolutionary resistance in Mongolia, and Choibalsan, as a founding member, now stood at the center of a movement that would irrevocably alter the nation's trajectory. Soon after the party's formation, Choibalsan, Sukbatar, and other MPP members were dispatched to Irkutsk to meet with Soviet officials and solicit assistance for their cause. These 7 revolutionaries, later remembered as the First Seven, included Danzan, Losol, Dogsum, Chagdarjov, El Dendev, Sukbatar, and Choibalsan himself. In Irkutsk, Choibalsan continued his military and political training and remained closely associated with Sukbatar, who became both a mentor and a trusted ally. The timing of their mission was fateful. Just as the revolutionaries were making inroads with the Soviets, the infamous White Russian general and monarchist Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg launched a surprise invasion of Mongolia from the east. In early 1921, his anti-Bolshevik forces drove out the Chinese and seized control of Korea, proclaiming a new imperial rule under the Bogd Khan. However, Ungern's medieval authoritarianism and brutal methods alienated the local population and strengthened the resolve of the revolutionaries. Recognizing the shifting geopolitical dynamics, the Soviets finally threw their support behind the MPP. In February 1921, the Mongolian revolutionaries regrouped in Troitskosavsk, now Kyakhta, on the Russian border. From there, Choibalsan and Sukhbatar organized partisan bands and began recruiting fighters. Choibalsan risked his life in covert missions back into Chinese and white-held territory, rallying supporters and smuggling key figures to safety. A crucial meeting took place from 1 to 3 March 1921 in Troitskosavsk, the first formal congress of the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party. At this congress, Choibalsan was elected to the Provisional Revolutionary Government and appointed political commissar of the Mongolian People's Army, now under the command of Sukhbatar. His duties were dual, serving as chief propagandist to inspire morale, and as a political officer ensuring revolutionary discipline and loyalty. Soon after, the combined Soviet Red Army and Mongolian revolutionary forces advanced against Ungern Sternberg's troops. In the spring and summer of 1921, they scored decisive victories culminating in the liberation of Korea on 6 July 1921. Choibalsan, commanding a unit in western Mongolia, participated in several skirmishes supporting the broader advance. By August, Ungern had been captured by Soviet forces and executed. Mongolia's capital was in revolutionary hands. The 1921 Mongolian Revolution had succeeded. A new chapter was being written, one that envisioned a secular, egalitarian, and Soviet-aligned state rising from the ashes of feudalism and foreign occupation. At its heart stood a cadre of young revolutionaries, among whom Khorloogiin Choibalsan was rapidly distinguishing himself, not for charisma or oratory, but for loyalty, fearlessness, and unflinching political adaptability. Despite his service in the revolution, Choibalsan's rise through the new regime was not immediate. While he remained deputy chief of the Mongolian People's Army and served as chairman of the Mongolian Revolutionary Youth League, he initially failed to break into the upper echelons of power. Other figures, such as Sukhbatar, Danzan, and Bodu, were viewed as more politically astute and ideologically reliable. Nonetheless, the revolution had permanently altered Choibalsan's path. He had cast aside the role of monk, left behind his peasant roots, and emerged as a committed revolutionary. More importantly, he had forged enduring ties to the Soviet Union, a relationship that would both empower and haunt him in the years to come. Part 3, Struggles in the Shadows, Political Marginalization and Rise Through Soviet Favor, to 1922-1932. Following the 1921 revolution, Mongolia embarked on the difficult and often chaotic task of state building under the auspices of the Mongolian People's Party, later renamed the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, or MPRP. Although Khorloogiin Choibalsan had been a key figure during the revolutionary struggle and was now a trusted military officer, his place in the post-revolutionary power structure was less assured. The years that followed were marked by personal instability, shifting political tides, and a tenuous climb through the ranks of government. These years in the political shadows would quietly shape Choibalsan into the formidable and ruthless figure he would later become. In 1922, the Mongolian government, still fragile and wary of factionalism, saw its first major internal political crisis. Prime Minister Dogzamyn Bodu, one of Choibalsan's early mentors, had embarked on a modernization campaign designed to reform Mongolian dress and culture, including the forced removal of feudal ornaments like women's jewelry, long hair, and traditional robes. These abrupt and heavy-handed reforms were executed by young revolutionaries, particularly members of the Mongolian Revolutionary Youth League, led by none other than Choibalsan. The backlash from the public was swift and unforgiving. Traditionalists viewed the reforms as attacks on national identity, and Bodu's enemies within the party capitalized on the discontent. In August 1922, Bodu was arrested, accused of counter-revolutionary activity, and swiftly executed. Although Choibalsan had played a role in implementing Bodu's reforms, he was not held accountable to the same degree. However, the fallout cost him dearly. He was stripped of his full party membership and removed from his military post. Only the intervention of Damdin Sukh-Batar, who was still widely revered as the hero of the revolution, spared him from imprisonment or death. The next few years saw Choibalsan effectively sidelined from political power. He took refuge in academia and administration, holding low-profile positions including that of director of the National Museum. For a revolutionary who had fought in battles and helped form the People's Army, this was a humiliating fall from grace. At the same time, he indulged in heavy drinking and formed a reputation for erratic behavior, womanizing, and occasional violence, traits that further alienated him from more disciplined members of the leadership. His speeches from this era were few and unremarkable, and he would later omit this entire phase from his collected writings. In 1923, tragedy struck when Sukh-Batar died under mysterious circumstances at the age of just 30. The death of the revolution's central figure created a power vacuum within the MPRP and removed one of the few individuals who had consistently protected Choibalsan. Nonetheless, it opened up space for others to rise, including Choibalsan himself. Perhaps seeking to rehabilitate him, the Soviet Union intervened and sent him to Moscow to study at a Russian military academy. This marked a turning point in his career. It was not his performance as a scholar that impressed his Soviet mentors, but rather his loyalty, adaptability, and potential as a pliable and zealous functionary. Upon returning to Mongolia in 1924, Choibalsan was offered a surprising appointment, Commander-in-Chief of the People's Revolutionary Troops, a post once held by his deceased mentor. This military promotion reinserted him into the corridors of power, though he still lacked political prestige compared to others like Solian Danzan or Tsaren Okiran Dambadorj. He was also appointed a member of the MPRP Central Committee and served in the Presidium of the State Great Khural from 1924 to 1928, a ceremonial body that gave him formal status without real policy-making authority. The ideological battle between leftists and rightists within the MPRP was heating up. At the Third Party Congress in 1924, Choibalsan aligned himself with the radical leftist Rinchingin Elbegdorj. Together, they supported the purge and execution of moderate party leader Solin Dansan, who had been accused of protecting bourgeois elements and engaging in dealings with Chinese businesses. With Danzan's removal, however, Elbegdorj and his allies, including Choibalsan, found themselves isolated. The party's moderate faction, now led by Dambadorj, assumed control, and Choibalsan once again faded from the center stage. Yet even as his political fortunes fluctuated, Choibalsan remained in close orbit of Soviet influence. The USSR was increasingly intervening in Mongolia's internal affairs, determined to shape it into a socialist satellite. This placed a premium on reliability over brilliance. The Soviets found in Choibalsan a man who, though often unpredictable and personally flawed, could be counted on to execute orders with unwavering obedience. It was around this time that Soviet Defense Commissar Kliment Voroshilov and other Moscow officials began to take a particular interest in Choibalsan's potential. The late 1920s saw the political pendulum swing back toward the left. At the Seventh Party Congress in 1928, Moscow orchestrated a purge of the moderate leadership and ushered in the Choibalsan, now more firmly within the Soviet sphere of confidence, was promoted to chairman of the Little Khural, the ceremonial head of state, making him one of the most visible faces of the new government. He wasted no time in aligning himself with the radical Soviet line. In 1929 and 1930, he threw his support behind aggressive policies aimed at dismantling the old Mongolian society. Land was expropriated, the power of the nobility shattered, and Buddhist institutions were systematically persecuted. Traditional herders were forced into collectivized farms, often with disastrous results. By the early 1930s, over a third of Mongolia's livestock had been decimated. Nearly 800 noble estates and monastic properties were confiscated, and hundreds of aristocrats were executed. The Buddhist clergy, once the dominant social force in Mongolia, faced increasing repression. Appointed Minister of Livestock and Agriculture in 1931, Choibalsan became one of the principal architects of forced collectivization. He issued decrees that intensified the push for socialist agriculture, despite widespread resistance. When violent uprisings broke out in Kufskoe, Arkhangai, and Zavkhan in 1932, Choibalsan supported Moscow's New Turn policy, a tactical pause in leftist excesses, but only as a temporary measure. Despite claims in later propaganda that he had opposed the radicalism of the leftist period, in truth, Choibalsan had been one of its most zealous enforcers. Though his star was still rising slowly, the 1930s would soon thrust him to the pinnacle of power. His absolute obedience to Soviet dictates, ideological malleability, and emerging reputation for ruthlessness would prove decisive. The seeds of terror had been sown, and in the next decade, Khorloogiin Choibalsan would become its most efficient gardener. Part 4. The Rise of the Executioner. Purges, Terror, and Total Power, 1932-1939. By the early 1930s, Khorloogiin Choibalsan was increasingly aligned with the rising Stalinist orthodoxy, and although he had not yet attained supreme control over the Mongolian state, his transformation into a loyal instrument of Soviet policy was well underway. The next phase of his political evolution would see him ascend from obscurity and insecurity to unprecedented power through a combination of opportunism, Soviet backing, and a willingness to employ brutal repression. It was in this period that Choibalsan would earn the moniker often attributed to him in retrospect, the Stalin of Mongolia. The stage for his rise was set by a confluence of political crises, ethnic paranoia, and Soviet imperial interests. The 1930s brought increasing pressure from Moscow to crack down on internal enemies, especially following the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Soviet fears of Japanese espionage and fifth-column activities among Mongolian buryats and political dissidents fed a toxic atmosphere of suspicion. The Kremlin sought a pliant and obedient strongman in Mongolia to carry out purges and ensure unflinching loyalty. And Choibalsan, with his proven obedience and Soviet connections, was the ideal candidate. In 1934, paranoia erupted into full-blown hysteria with the Lukumbi affair. Jambon Lukumbi, General Secretary of the MPRP and himself a buryat, was accused on fabricated evidence of leading a Japanese espionage ring. Over 1,500 people were arrested and 56 were executed. Choibalsan's name emerged in the early interrogations, prompting his sudden summons to Moscow. There he was interrogated by the NKVD, but instead of being imprisoned or purged, he was turned. Within days, he began assisting Soviet intelligence in identifying, torturing, and executing alleged co-conspirators. This act of betrayal of fellow revolutionaries and countrymen marked a sinister turning point. Moscow had found its man. Stalin was satisfied. Choibalsan, now firmly entrenched in the web of Soviet security services, was appointed deputy prime minister over the objections of Prime Minister Pelgedin Gendin, who loathed Choibalsan and distrusted Soviet interference. But Gendin's protests fell on deaf ears. Choibalsan's star continued to rise. In 1935, Stalin cemented Choibalsan's status with a symbolic gesture, a gift of 20 Soviet-manufactured Gaz automobiles. Choibalsan distributed these cars among the Mongolian elite, buying their loyalty and advertising his proximity to Stalin. The automobiles were more than mere machines. They were status symbols, tangible proof that Choibalsan was the chosen man of Moscow. The decisive year came in 1936. Choibalsan was appointed Marshal of the Mongolian Armed Forces, sharing the honor with the rising military figure Khorloogiin Choibalsan. That same year, Choibalsan assumed control of the newly elevated Ministry of Internal Affairs, a post that would allow him to command not only the police and security services, but also the intelligence apparatus, now increasingly staffed by NKVD operatives. A quarter of the ministry's staff were directly linked to the NKVD. Choibalsan wasted no time. Acting under Stalin's orders, He moved swiftly against his old rival in Mongolia's sitting prime minister, Khorloogiin Choibalsan. Gendon had refused to carry out Stalin's demand that the Buddhist clergy be eradicated, and in Stalin's eyes he had grown too independent. In 1936, Choibalsan denounced Gendon for sabotaging Mongol-Soviet relations. Gendon was arrested, shipped to Moscow, and eventually executed. In his place, the more compliant Anandin Amar was made prime minister, but real power now resided with Choibalsan. Later that same year, Choibalsan authorized new procedures that allowed the Ministry of Internal Affairs to detain and execute high-ranking individuals without party approval. The road to terror had been paved. In August 1937, a major political rival and fellow marshal, Khorloogiin Choibalsan, died suddenly under suspicious circumstances while en route to Moscow. Rumors swirled of poisoning. With Demed out of the way, Choibalsan became the unchallenged military leader, holding both the top command in the army and control of internal security. On 10th of September 1937, the first wave of high-level arrests began. 65 senior officials were rounded up overnight. All were accused of espionage for Japan and of collaborating in a Gendon-Demed plot. Confessions, extracted through torture, followed. The first public show trial took place in October. Of the 14 men tried, 13 were sentenced to death. It was only the beginning. Over the next 18 months, a reign of terror engulfed Mongolia. Choibalsan presided over the most brutal purge in the nation's history. Over 17,000 monks were executed. Thousands of others were forcibly defrocked. Of the country's 800 functioning monasteries, 746 were destroyed. But the purges extended beyond the clergy. Political opponents, intellectuals, members of the military, ethnic minorities, and ordinary citizens were all swept into the bloodletting. A total of 25 top political figures, 187 senior military officials, and most of the MPRP's Central Committee were executed. Gulags were constructed across the countryside to house the survivors of the purge. Others simply disappeared into the night. Although much of the planning and logistical execution was orchestrated by Soviet advisors, Choibalsan was not a passive observer. While often heavily intoxicated, he attended interrogations, ordered arrests, and occasionally participated in torture. He personally signed execution orders and sometimes amended arrest lists to include rivals or former friends with whom he had quarreled. What had once been the revolution's poet-warrior had become its executioner. At the height of the purges, Choibalsan even turned on his former revolutionary comrades. Dogsom and Losol, the last surviving members of the original First Seven, who had founded the Mongolian People's Party, were arrested. Dogsom was executed in 1941. Losol died in a Soviet prison before his trial could begin. Choibalsan stood alone, the sole survivor of Mongolia's revolutionary pioneers. The stress took a toll on his health and mind. From August 1938 to January 1939, he disappeared to Moscow and Sochi for medical treatment and consultations with Stalin, Yezhov, and Voroshilov. During his absence, the NKVD and their Mongolian allies carried on the purges. When he returned, he brought down the curtain on the Great Terror with a chilling sleight of hand. He declared that the excesses had occurred while he had been away and blamed a few overzealous subordinates. He then had them executed as scapegoats. With the purge complete, Choibalsan emerged as Mongolia's unchallenged ruler. He now simultaneously held the posts of Prime Minister, Minister of War, Minister of Internal Affairs, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and de facto head of the party. What had begun as a young man's rebellion had culminated in a dictatorship drenched in blood. The revolution had devoured its children, and the only one left standing was Choibalsan. Part 5, The Wartime Strongman, Khalkhin Gol and Mongolian Support for the USSR, 1939-1945. By 1939, Khorloogiin Choibalsan stood alone at the summit of Mongolian political life, unchallenged, all-powerful, and feared. The Great Terror had eliminated most of his contemporaries and rivals, and Choibalsan now held every significant position in the Mongolian government. However, his tenure as dictator would soon be tested on a far more volatile and deadly frontier, The border with Imperial Japan. Throughout the 1930s, relations between the Soviet Union and Japan had grown increasingly tense. After Japan's 1931 invasion of Manchuria and the establishment of the puppet state of Manchukuo, Japanese military leaders looked westward to expand their influence into Mongolia, seen as a Soviet satellite. The stage for confrontation was set along Mongolia's eastern border with Japanese-occupied Manchuria, where territorial claims remained unresolved. In the spring of 1939, border skirmishes erupted between Mongolian forces and Japanese patrols near the Khalkhin Gol, Khalkha River region, not far from Choibalsan's birthplace. These initial clashes quickly escalated into full-scale warfare. The Japanese Kwantung Army underestimated the resolve and coordination between Mongolia and the USSR, assuming they would crumble under pressure. What followed, however, was one of the most significant but underappreciated battles of the pre-World War II period. The Soviet response, coordinated with Mongolia, was swift and decisive. The Red Army deployed tens of thousands of troops under the command of the rising Soviet general Georgy Zhukov. Choibalsan, although not a battlefield commander in the operational sense, took an active role in political coordination, mobilization of resources, and maintaining Mongolian morale. As commander-in-chief and head of state, he was constantly present in military command centers and frontline outposts, reinforcing his image as Mongolia's wartime leader. The fighting culminated in a massive Soviet-Mongolian counteroffensive in August 1939. Zhukov executed a brilliant pincer movement that encircled and destroyed the Japanese forces near Nomonhan. The Japanese suffered devastating losses, over 8,000 killed or wounded, and were forced to retreat, effectively ending Japanese incursions into Mongolian territory. The Mongolian People's Army, though small compared to the Soviet divisions, had played a critical support role and suffered its own share of casualties. For Choibalsan, the victory at Khalkhin Gol was more than a military success. It was a moment of immense political capital. He was hailed as a national hero and champion of Mongolian sovereignty. State propaganda emphasized his leadership and courage, burnishing his personality cult. Posters, speeches, and newspaper articles portrayed him as the defender of the homeland and the indispensable protector of Mongolia against imperialist aggression. The triumph at Khalkhin Gol also solidified Choibalsan's already tight bond with Stalin. It confirmed Mongolia's strategic value to the USSR and further entrenched the country in the Soviet sphere of influence. Shortly after the battles, Choibalsan made overtures to strengthen military and diplomatic ties with Moscow, renewing defense agreements and inviting more Soviet military advisors to Ulaanbaatar. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Mongolia was among the first countries to express full solidarity with the USSR. Though Mongolia did not officially declare war on Germany, it functioned throughout the war as a loyal and generous rear base for the Soviet war effort. At Choibalsan's urging, the Mongolian economy was reorganized to serve the Soviet cause. Despite its limited resources, the country made enormous sacrifices to support the Red Army. Choibalsan spearheaded initiatives to expand livestock herds to meet Soviet demands for meat, leather, and wool. Mongolian herders were compelled to increase production beyond their means, often suffering hardship as a result. Thousands of tons of meat, hides, sheepskin coats, and felt boots were sent to Soviet troops on the Eastern Front. These items were essential to survival in the harsh Russian winters. The Mongolian government also contributed direct financial assistance. War bonds, cash donations, and entire trainloads of supplies were collected and sent eastward. In one extraordinary gesture of wartime solidarity, Mongolia financed the creation of an entire tank brigade for the Red Army, known as the Revolutionary Mongolia Tank Brigade. The brigade fought with distinction in battles across Europe, earning respect and gratitude from Soviet commanders. In 1942, Choibalsan and Khorloogiin Choibalsan, the young Secretary General of the MPRP, traveled to Moscow and visited Soviet troops near the front lines. They brought with them trainloads of Mongolian provisions and personally delivered coats, boots, and gifts to soldiers. The journey was heavily publicized as a testament to Mongolia's unshakable loyalty to its northern ally. Back home, Choibalsan's rule tightened further. Though the worst of the purges had passed, repression continued, particularly against those suspected of harboring counter-revolutionary views. Arrests and executions persisted, albeit at lower intensity. The party membership ballooned as loyalty to the regime became a requirement for upward mobility. Public life remained suffused with fear, and Choibalsan's personality cult reached new heights during the war. Yet despite the atmosphere of control, the wartime years also brought meaningful development to Mongolia. With Soviet encouragement and guidance, Choibalsan's government expanded education, modernized parts of the economy, and introduced limited industrialization. The country's first university, Choibalsan University, opened in 1942, funded largely by Soviet aid. Medical services were improved, literacy campaigns were launched, and infrastructure projects began to connect remote provinces to the capital. In religious life, however, little reprieve was given. The Buddhist clergy remained under tight surveillance, and monasteries continued to decline. The use of traditional Mongolian script was gradually phased out in favor of Cyrillic, further aligning the nation with the Soviet cultural model. As the war neared its end in 1945, Choibalsan saw new possibilities for expanding Mongolia's influence, particularly in regions like Inner Mongolia, where ethnic Mongols lived under Chinese rule. He believed that his wartime loyalty to Stalin might finally yield the ultimate reward, pan-Mongolian unification. That hope, however, would be tested and eventually dashed in the years ahead. Still, by 1945, Choibalsan stood at the height of his influence. He had transformed Mongolia from a feudal backwater into a militarized socialist satellite. His dictatorship had survived its own brutality, bolstered by Soviet victory and loyalty. The world was changing, but Khorloogiin Choibalsan was now more powerful, more confident, and more determined than ever. Part 6. Dreams of Greater Mongolia. Post-war ambitions and the Cold War order, 1945-1949. With the defeat of Nazi Germany in May 1945 and the tides of World War II turning irrevocably against Japan, Khorloogiin Choibalsan emerged from the war as a triumphant and resolute leader. His unwavering loyalty to Stalin had paid enormous dividends. Mongolia's strategic importance had been reaffirmed, its role as the Soviet Union's most trusted Asian ally cemented, and Choibalsan's stature elevated to near mythical proportions in the eyes of many of his countrymen. Yet for all his victories, Choibalsan remained haunted by one unfulfilled dream, the unification of all Mongols under one banner, a pan-Mongolia that extended beyond the artificial borders imposed by imperial powers. This grand vision of a Greater Mongolia had long simmered in Choibalsan's imagination. The ethnic Mongol populations in Inner Mongolia, parts of Xinjiang, and even in regions of the Russian Far East remained culturally and linguistically tied to their brethren in the Mongolian People's Republic. Now, with Japan weakened and the Chinese Civil War in full swing, Choibalsan saw a fleeting opportunity to finally achieve what he considered the rightful national destiny of the Mongol people. On 10th August 1945, just days after the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, Mongolia followed suit and declared its own war against the Japanese Empire. Mongolian troops, in coordination with Soviet forces, participated in the Soviet-led Manchurian strategic offensive operation. As Soviet armies surged into Manchuria, Choibalsan ordered his forces southward across the Great Wall and deep into Inner Mongolia, reaching as far as Zhangjiakou and Chengde. In the Mongolian press, this campaign was celebrated not merely as a military action, but as the beginning of ethnic and national reunification. Choibalsan stoked the flames of pan-Mongolism with a flurry of propaganda. Newspapers published fiery articles calling for the unification of all Mongols. Ethnic solidarity was emphasized in schools, rallies, and political meetings. Mongolian officers and party officials were dispatched to Inner Mongolian towns to organize support and establish contact with local leaders. It was a bold and provocative campaign, and Stalin was not pleased. Despite Choibalsan's wartime devotion, Stalin had no interest in pan-Mongolian unity. The Soviet Union's post-war priorities were diplomatic stability with a rising communist China and the consolidation of influence through client states, not the redrawing of borders to accommodate nationalist fantasies. At the height of the campaign, Stalin sent a stern directive. Choibalsan's forces were to retreat immediately. Disobedience would not be tolerated. Crushed but obedient, Choibalsan recalled his troops. The dream of a greater Mongolia, so close he could taste it, was abruptly extinguished. Inner Mongolia would remain within China's new communist state, and the artificial boundaries of the past would become the entrenched borders of the Cold War future. Although his geopolitical ambitions were thwarted, Choibalsan returned to Ulaanbaatar with renewed resolve to consolidate Mongolia's socialist transformation. Inspired by the Soviet model, he launched the country's first five-year plan in 1948. This comprehensive strategy focused on industrial development, infrastructure expansion, and agricultural collectivization. Though Mongolia remained largely rural, Choibalsan envisioned a modern, socialist nation powered by science, electricity, and party discipline. Under his leadership, key sectors began to evolve. Mining was expanded, particularly coal and metals. New railways connected isolated provinces to the capital, and modern communication systems were introduced. Education reforms accelerated. Schools were built in rural areas, the literacy rate rose dramatically, and the use of the Cyrillic script replaced traditional Mongolian writing, further aligning the country with Soviet norms. Health services were expanded, and the foundations of a modern welfare state took shape. In addition to these material gains, Choibalsan pushed for cultural transformation. The Buddhist faith remained under tight restrictions, with monasteries still closed or repurposed, and clergy members subjected to surveillance. A state-controlled version of Mongolian identity, rooted in nationalism but bound to socialism, became the dominant narrative. Monuments, schools, and publications glorified the revolution, the MPRP, and Choibalsan himself. One of his proudest achievements was the development of higher education. In 1942, with Soviet assistance, the National University of Mongolia, later known as Choibalsan University, opened in Ulaanbaatar. It became the intellectual heart of the new Mongolia, training generations of teachers, engineers, and ideologically loyal party cadres. Despite these advancements, political repression never entirely abated. Though the mass executions of the late 1930s were over, Choibalsan's internal security apparatus remained active. Between 1945 and 1949, sporadic purges continued against perceived enemies of the state. In 1947, a fabricated plot known as the Port Arthur affair led to the arrest of 80 individuals, 42 of whom were executed. Choibalsan claimed that these conspirators had planned to assassinate him during a public celebration. The affair served as both a warning to his enemies and a reaffirmation of his unshakable authority. Meanwhile, Choibalsan sought to reinforce Mongolia's diplomatic position. In 1946, he renewed the 1936 Treaty of Friendship and Mutual Assistance with the USSR for another 10 years. That same year, under heavy Soviet pressure, China formally recognized Mongolia's independence following a highly controlled plebiscite in which the Mongolian population overwhelmingly, and unsurprisingly, voted in favor of sovereignty. It was a major symbolic victory, and Choibalsan used it to underscore his role as the guardian of the nation's independence. Emboldened by this success, Choibalsan expanded Mongolia's international relationships with fellow socialist states. In 1948, he established formal ties with North Korea, and in 1949, Mongolia became the first country to officially recognize the newly founded People's Republic of China. The move was calculated. It ensured Mongolia's place in the communist bloc and helped defuse Beijing's long-standing territorial claims over the country. And yet, even in the midst of his political triumph, a quiet disillusionment was beginning to grow. Choibalsan had given everything to Stalin, his loyalty, his independence, and the blood of thousands of his countrymen in exchange for national dignity and the dream of unification. But now it was clear, Stalin would never allow Greater Mongolia to exist. When his younger protégés, including Sedenbaum, suggested that Mongolia apply to become part of the Soviet Union, as Tuva had done in 1944, Choibalsan rebuked them harshly. He was Stalin's man, yes, but he would not see Mongolia dissolved into the Russian colossus. By the end of 1949, Choibalsan had transformed Mongolia into a fully Stalinized state, centralized, militarized, and subservient. But the price had been high: cultural homogenization, thousands of dead, and a country dependent in every sense on its northern patron. As the world plunged into the Cold War and the communist order spread across Asia, Choibalsan stood as a symbol of both national pride and tragic submission. A man who had gained everything and yet been denied his deepest ambition. Part 7. Final Years. Decline, Illness, and the End of a Dictator, 1950-1952. By the dawn of the 1950s, Khorloogiin Choibalsan was entering the twilight of his life and rule. At 60 years old, the once fiery, revolutionary, and wartime strongman remained the most powerful figure in Mongolia. But his physical strength was waning, his political vision narrowing, and his emotional burdens growing heavier. While the Mongolian People's Republic remained tightly under his control, the very system he had helped build now required constant vigilance, endless purges, and deepening repression to maintain its authority. The shadow of death and the burden of unmet ambitions loomed ever larger. Internationally, Mongolia was becoming more engaged with the wider socialist world. Choibalsan understood the importance of securing recognition for the Mongolian People's Republic as a legitimate and sovereign state. Diplomatic efforts intensified. In 1949, Mongolia became the first nation to recognize the newly declared People's Republic of China, an important gesture of communist solidarity. In the years that followed, diplomatic relations were established with North Korea and various Eastern Bloc countries, including East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. These steps strengthened Mongolia's place within the global communist order, but always under the protective umbrella of the Soviet Union. Choibalsan continued to emphasize ideological orthodoxy and party loyalty as prerequisites for advancement. The Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, MPRP, expanded its influence across all sectors of life: industry, agriculture, education, and culture. Party membership doubled between 1940 and 1947, rising to nearly 28,000 members. The centralization of power was absolute, and Choibalsan's cult of personality grew more elaborate. Portraits of him hung in every government office and school. State media portrayed him as the father of the nation and Stalin. Yet beneath the surface, signs of strain were evident. His failure to achieve pan-Mongolian unification weighed heavily on him, and his relationship with Stalin, once built on total loyalty, began to fray. By 1949, Choibalsan's faith in his Soviet patron was no longer as unwavering. He resented Stalin's refusal to support Mongolian unification after World War II, and was increasingly irritated by Soviet interference in internal Mongolian affairs. When Stalin celebrated his 70th birthday in 1949 with great fanfare in Moscow, Choibalsan conspicuously declined to attend, sending his protege Khorloogiin Choibalsan in his place, a gesture that did not go unnoticed in the Kremlin. Tensions also arose within the Mongolian leadership. Choibalsan, ambitious and favored by Stalin, had become Secretary General of the MPRP in 1940. As the 1950s approached, Choibalsan began consolidating his own influence, positioning himself as Choibalsan's eventual successor. Younger, more ideologically rigid, and untainted by the worst of the 1930s purges, Choibalsan represented a new generation of communist leadership. Choibalsan, though still firmly in control, was increasingly surrounded by officials more loyal to Moscow or to Choibalsan than to him. Meanwhile, the machinery of repression remained active. Though the Great Terror had ended in 1939, periodic purges of the intelligentsia and the bureaucracy continued into the 1950s. In 1950, a particularly shocking episode occurred: the fabrication of a so-called Port Arthur conspiracy, allegedly aimed at assassinating Choibalsan during a national celebration. 80 people were arrested in connection with this plot. 42 were executed. Whether Choibalsan genuinely believed in the existence of such threats or used them as political theater to reinforce his authority is unclear. What is certain is that he remained deeply paranoid and obsessed with the maintenance of his personal security. By late 1951, Choibalsan's health began to deteriorate rapidly. He had long suffered from a range of ailments exacerbated by years of stress, alcoholism, and poor living conditions. Eventually, he was diagnosed with terminal kidney cancer. The Soviet authorities, now firmly in control of Mongolian medical infrastructure, insisted that he be transported to Moscow for treatment. Some accounts suggest that this request was not entirely voluntary, possibly motivated by a desire to keep the terminally ill leader under observation. He arrived in Moscow in early January 1952 and was admitted to a state hospital. Despite receiving treatment with the best medical technology available to the USSR at the time, his condition worsened. On 26 January 1952, Khorloogiin Choibalsan died in Moscow at the age of 56. He passed away far from his homeland, surrounded by Soviet officials and doctors, without the presence of his closest family or allies. The death of Mongolia's most powerful leader in modern history sent shockwaves through the MPRP and the broader Mongolian public. News of his passing was delivered with great ceremony, and a state funeral was held in Ulaanbaatar. His body was transported back to the capital by a special train, accompanied by an honor guard and high-ranking Soviet officials. Thousands of mourners lined the streets of the capital, many dressed in black, carrying flowers and banners bearing his portrait. The funeral was not merely a state ritual, it was a carefully staged performance of unity, loyalty, and grief. Following the funeral, Choibalsan was interred at the Altan-Olgi National Cemetery, Mongolia's most prestigious burial ground. But 2 years later, in 1954, his remains were moved to the newly constructed Sukbatar Mausoleum in Sukbatar Square, where he was laid to rest beside Damdin Sukbatar, his early revolutionary comrade and national hero. For decades, the mausoleum stood as a sacred symbol of Mongolia's revolutionary past, enshrining the two most mythologized leaders of the socialist era. Choibalsan's personal life had always been a guarded and controlled subject. He had married twice, first to a Buddhist seamstress named Khorloogiin in 1921, whom he divorced in 1935, and later to Gundegma, with whom he had no biological children. In 1937, he adopted the son of one of his subordinates in the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and his second wife later adopted a girl named Sood. These relationships, however, were peripheral to his public image. The state portrayed him not as a family man, but as the father of the nation. As he was laid to rest with all the honors of a national hero, the deeper truth of Choibalsan's legacy remained unspoken. He had brought education, healthcare, and infrastructure to Mongolia, but he had also brought death, fear, and dependency. He was both a builder and a destroyer, and now with his passing, a new chapter in Mongolia's history was about to begin, one shaped by the man he had chosen to succeed him, Khorloogiin Choibalsan. Part 8, The Legacy of the Steel Shadow, Cult, Critique, and Historical Memory, 1952-1990. Following Khorloogiin Choibalsan's death in 1952, the Mongolian People's Republic entered a new political era. Leadership passed quietly and seamlessly into the hands of his longtime protege, Khorloogiin Choibalsan, a transition carefully managed by Moscow. But while Choibalsan was gone, his presence continued to loom over the country he had dominated for nearly 2 decades. His legacy was preserved not only in monuments and slogans, but in institutions, policies, and the psychological architecture of a society molded by fear and obedience. For several years after his death, Choibalsan's cult of personality remained intact and carefully curated. His portrait adorned schoolrooms, government offices, and party congress halls. His speeches and writings, meticulously edited, were published in collected volumes. History textbooks credited him with leading Mongolia from medieval backwardness into the light of socialism. The mausoleum where his body lay alongside Damdin Sukbatar became a site of pilgrimage and national reverence. Visitors to Ulaanbaatar were often escorted to Sukbatar Square to witness the monument of eternal revolution, guarded day and night by uniformed sentries. State media elevated his mythic stature even further. Children were taught that Choibalsan had saved Mongolia from Japanese invasion, modernized its economy, educated its people, and forged a permanent alliance with the USSR. His role in the bloody purges of the 1930s was never mentioned. Instead, those years were quietly attributed to errors of lower-level officials, or more commonly, not addressed at all. In this heavily sanitized narrative, Choibalsan was the wise father of the people, a kind yet firm protector of national independence. This carefully managed image owed much to Stalin, who had every reason to maintain the stability of the regime and his own claim to legitimacy as Choibalsan's chosen successor. Any public reckoning with Choibalsan's crimes risked undermining the moral authority of the party itself. Moreover, Stalin had been a junior participant in the machinery of repression and had benefited directly from Choibalsan's mentorship. As such, de-Stalinization, the wave of reform and historical revision that swept the Soviet Union under Khrushchev after 1956, never gained serious momentum in Mongolia. Nonetheless, some cracks began to form. In 1956, the MPRP Central Committee released a vague statement acknowledging crude violations of revolutionary law during Choibalsan's rule and blaming him personally for thousands of deaths. The statement was not widely disseminated, and it sparked little public discussion. In 1962, the party again vowed to eliminate the harmful consequences of the cult of personality, echoing Soviet language. But this too remained largely rhetorical. For the average Mongolian citizen, Choibalsan remained more a symbol than a man, a towering figure of ambiguous morality, half deified and half feared. What complicated this legacy further was the fact that Choibalsan had overseen genuine progress in many areas. Under his leadership, literacy rates had soared. A national university had been founded. Healthcare became available even in rural provinces. The foundations of a modern state, roadways, railroads, electrical grids, and industrial zones had been laid. For many Mongolians who had grown up in poverty and isolation, the 1940s and 1950s represented their first access to schooling, medicine, and national identity. Moreover, Choibalsan's status as the leader who preserved Mongolia's independence from China gave him an enduring reservoir of nationalist respect. While the country had become a satellite of the Soviet Union, it had nonetheless retained formal sovereignty and international recognition, something that had not been guaranteed in the turbulent years following the Qing dynasty's collapse. Choibalsan had made enormous concessions to Moscow, but he had also protected his nation from absorption by more powerful neighbors. Still, public memory was selective. Survivors of the Great Terror, the relatives of the 17,000 monks, nobles, and officials executed under Choibalsan's orders, carried quiet grief and lingering resentment. Stories were whispered in private homes, of fathers arrested at night and never returned, of monasteries burned to the ground, of school teachers who vanished for teaching the wrong poem. But fear still kept most people silent. The mausoleum in Sukbatar Square remained a potent symbol of the past. Every year on national holidays, delegations of school children and party members laid wreaths at its base. The embalmed bodies of Sukbatar and Choibalsan, preserved like Lenin's in Moscow, were solemnly presented as the twin fathers of the nation, martyrs of revolution and unity. In reality, the contrast between them could not have been starker. Sukbatar, the romantic and idealistic revolutionary who died young; Choibalsan, the hardened autocrat who ruled with an iron fist and stained the soil with blood. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, occasional attempts to re-evaluate Choibalsan's legacy were made by foreign historians, especially in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, but they rarely gained traction inside Mongolia. Tsedenbal's own authoritarian tendencies ensured that Choibalsan's actions remained insulated from open critique. The official history of the revolution was never questioned, and the files of the Ministry of Internal Affairs remained sealed. Only with the political liberalization movement sweeping the Eastern Bloc in the late 1980s did the first real cracks begin to appear. In 1989, Mongolian intellectuals, students, and exiled dissidents began openly calling for democratic reforms, transparency, and historical truth. Among their demands was the deconstruction of the personality cults that had dominated Mongolian political life for half a century. Then came 1990. As protests swept through Ulaanbaatar and pressure mounted on the Communist Party, Mongolia experienced its own peaceful democratic revolution. Sedenbal had already been ousted in 1984, but now the party itself surrendered its monopoly on power. In the political thaw that followed, historians, journalists, and surviving victims of the purges began to speak more freely. Archives were cautiously opened. State media published retrospective accounts. The names of the murdered, once omitted from official records, were finally read aloud in public forums. And so, Choibalsan's myth began to unravel. Part 9. Reassessing the Tyrant. Choibalsan's post-communist reputation and historical significance, 1990-present. With the collapse of the Mongolian People's Republic and the peaceful democratic revolution of 1990, the foundations of Mongolia's one-party socialist system were swept away. The Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party abandoned Marxist-Leninist ideology, multi-party democracy was established, and for the first time in nearly 7 decades, Mongolians could openly debate their past. At the center of that reckoning stood one towering figure, Khorloogiin Choibalsan. For decades, Choibalsan had been portrayed as a hero of the revolution, a protector of independence, and the architect of modern Mongolia. But as the walls of censorship fell and classified archives were cautiously opened, a fuller, darker portrait began to emerge. One of a man who, under the guise of progress and revolution, had presided over mass executions, systematic repression, and a regime of fear modeled explicitly on Stalinist terror. In the 1990s, efforts to deconstruct the lingering myths around Choibalsan intensified. Independent newspapers, memoirs of survivors, and foreign researchers brought new light to the purges of the 1930s, including the scale of the Buddhist clergy's annihilation, the destruction of monasteries, and the Soviet orchestration of mass arrests. Investigations into the Great Repression revealed that at least 17,000 people were executed under Choibalsan's direct or tacit orders. This represented a staggering toll for a small nation, and the trauma of these years was found to echo through generations. Still, public opinion about Choibalsan remained divided, and in many ways, it still does. Some Mongolians continued to regard him with nationalist pride. He was, after all, the man who had held Mongolia together in a volatile geopolitical environment, prevented annexation by China, and laid the foundations of a modern education system and public health infrastructure. For people in the countryside who had benefited from these advances, and for older generations who had grown up under his rule, Choibalsan was not so much a tyrant as a strong leader who had done what was necessary to protect Mongolia's sovereignty in dangerous times. Others, especially intellectuals, human rights advocates, and the descendants of purge victims, viewed Choibalsan as a brutal dictator who sold Mongolia's independence to Stalin in exchange for personal power. His willingness to collaborate with the NKVD, his role in ordering executions, and his obsession with control were, in their eyes, unforgivable. To them, he was less a nationalist than a puppet, a man who had traded Mongolian blood for Soviet protection. The fate of his physical legacy reflected these ambiguities. In 2005, the Sukbatar Mausoleum, where Choibalsan's embalmed body had lain for over 5 decades beside Damdin Sukbatar, was demolished as part of a broader reevaluation of Mongolia's socialist past. Under Buddhist supervision, Choibalsan's and Sukbatar's remains were exhumed, ritually cremated, and reinterred at the Altan-Olgi National Cemetery. It was a quiet, dignified end for 2 men who had once symbolized the revolutionary state. And yet the process of reevaluation has remained incomplete. Today, a statue of Choibalsan still stands in front of the National University of Mongolia in Ulaanbaatar, an institution he helped found and that once bore his name. Streets, schools, and the city of Choibalsan in Dorno province still carry his name. Unlike the statue of Stalin, which was removed from the National Library in the early 1990s, Choibalsan's image was never fully erased from the national consciousness. In some ways, this reflects Mongolia's complex relationship with its own 20th century history, a struggle between remembering and forgetting, between mourning and pride. In 2017, the Bank of Mongolia issued a commemorative coin bearing Choibalsan's likeness. While some saw this as a tribute to a foundational leader, others criticized it as a tone-deaf gesture that ignored the deep wounds still felt by victims' families. The coin became a symbol of the unresolved debate over Choibalsan's place in history. Today, historians recognize Choibalsan as a paradoxical figure. He was both a revolutionary and a dictator, a nationalist and a Soviet instrument, a modernizer and a destroyer. His life was defined by the contradictions of the age he lived in, a time when ideology justified cruelty, when survival demanded loyalty to foreign powers, and when power itself became the end as much as the means. He remains in many ways a mirror for modern Mongolia, a nation still emerging from the long shadow of socialism, still navigating its identity between the East and the West, still trying to reconcile the promises of revolution with the cost of repression. In the end, Khorloogiin Choibalsan's legacy cannot be reduced to a monument or a coin. It lives in the roads he paved, the schools he built, the monasteries he raised, and the memories, proud, bitter, and painful, that his rule left behind.